Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore's webinar on Myanmar and Egypt, how the military's economic interests complicate political transition. What I hope that we're going to be doing today is something more experimental or exploratory, if you wish, and in a sense, venture into uncharted ground. We've got two very prominent scholars with us, Professor Hitwe Tien of Curtin University in Australia, who is an expert on business and economic development in Myanmar, as well as the military's economic interests. And we have Dr. Yezid Sayigh, who in my mind is one of the world's foremost experts on civil-military relations in the Middle East, and who has done a lot of work on Egypt and Turkey, among others. And what I'm hoping that we can tease out, and there are obviously many more examples for this, Thailand, Indonesia, perhaps Algeria, where you have a history of military rule or military intervention, and in which one of the drivers of that intervention or rule were the economic interests of the military. And so what I'm hoping that we're going to be able to do, as much with the presentations of our two honored guests, as well as in the Q&A and discussion, tease out what the differences and what the similarities are and what we may be able to learn from that. Anybody who has questions or comments, you can raise your hand and we will give you the floor as soon as we've gone through the presentations and maybe an initial Q&A. So if I can turn over the virtual floor to you, Hitwe, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor James. Very honored to be here. So my topic is on the military coup in Myanmar, and it's aptly titled Taking Care of Business. So my name is Thuy Thuy Thain, Associate Professor at School of Management, Curtin University, Perth. So I'm in Perth talking, I'm not in Myanmar. So this, my hypothesis, like many others, is that the 1st February coup in Myanmar is partly about protecting the economic interest of the military elite. So from the political power gained in that 20 years period, economic power, and that in turn has given military the interest to regain the political power. So the military interest rests in these two conglomerates, which we are now looking at. Okay, so why economic interest is so important? Because in Myanmar, we have this saying, so that when I was writing it, this saying came to me. You know, I grew up, my mom probably used this, learned it from her. You can touch the top of my head, but you don't dare touch the wallet tucked away in my waist. So in that sense, this landslide victory of the NLD in the 2020 election, given them this, a power to indicate that this military political interest is now diluted. So if that parliament on the 1st February went ahead, the speculations are that the political interest is now diluted, of course, because it's a big landslide victory by the NLD, that in turn will dilute economic power of the military as well. So why? Because there's some indications from the NLD that this term, the new term, it is partly to demilitarize the country's bureaucracy, the government. For example, So this department called the General Administration Department, which is under Home Affairs, has now come under NLD, civilian control. That's very significant because this GAD has the power to appoint key bureaucratic positions. So if the military has lost this power, then the bureaucracy will be slowly filled with NLD members, democratically inclined members. So that's kind of damaging to the military's economic interest. And also NLD has a few times indicated that they wanted to change the mining laws, for example, to give a small medium enterprises a right to mine rather than currently dominated by the military, the crony companies, militia groups, ethnic militia groups, and Chinese businesses. So it's a very much dominated, very lucrative, and some reports that it's nearly as big as the country's economy or half of it. It's extremely lucrative, but very much monopolized by the military and its associates. So that the NLD indicated a few times to loosen this military grip on this very lucrative jade mining north of the country. Okay, so the prominent role of the military as protector in a nationalist sense. So I just want to go back 1 minute to see the mindset, the military mindset in this, throughout the history. So it has occupied a prominent role in the nationalist sense in military's head, in their mentality set, and also we've been trained, also we've been taught that the military was our protector in the nation. Definitely played a big, important role in the Myanmar's anti-colonial movement against the British. And since the gaining of independence from the British, the military also has been in fighting with ethnic insurgencies. Then we had a very brief period of parliamentary period, and then the military coup in 1960, which introduced Myanmar way to socialism, and that has brought the economy down to its knees, and then considered to be one of the poorest nations on earth. And then after that, we have since 1988-89, we have again military slog, and SPDC remained in power. So in that sense, we've been under military rule for 2 decades, right? Up until 2011. So that along that way, the successive governments as SLOG, as BDC have paved the way, making sure the permanent and dominant rule of the military as the military returned to the barracks. So these conglomerates, 2 conglomerates, how did they come about? In 1988-89, when the system changed to socialist system to marketization. So the word marketization was used. It's a particular, economic term, but it was so much used and widespread that, you ask a taxi driver, they know. So we are in the age of marketization, meaning opening up Myanmar to international trade. So when that happened, military saw the opportunity to modernize the economy and to exploit, to take advantage of this foreign direct investment coming in, to make money, to support the welfare of the retired military personnel, and as well as active serving military personnel, especially the top brass. So they have their own shares in these conglomerates. So in that context of marketization, these 2 conglomerates born and prospered. But that context characterized by two. Immediately, Myanmar, as soon as it opened, unfortunately went under military US sanctions under the Clinton administration. That has pushed Myanmar to work with neighboring countries, including Singapore, Malaysia, and China. So that period where Myanmar didn't have Western friends under the isolationist move, so the development of the economy very skewed towards working with Asian businesses, and also pushed towards mining, oil and gas, jade mining, land grabbing, this sort of unproductive and damaging to ordinary people. This sort of initiatives happened. So in that particular context, these two were born to serve to cement the dominant position of the military. So very quickly, how they raise capital. So first through privatization of state-owned enterprises in the 90s, and in two waves, in fire sale, very untransparent nature, and the nation's properties, land went to military-owned conglomerates, and also the government's associates, close associates, and now they are known as cronies. Even a little kid on the street knows what crony means and who are the cronies. So it's a crony capitalism is born. And these conglomerates were so big monopolies that anyone wanted to do business had to go through them, and also import and export license, which were very lucrative, very expensive, were controlled by them. And for example, rice trading, import of vehicles, mobile phone licenses. So through this rent-seeking, these conglomerates and cronies made money. And the land grabbing it's very common as well for mining, for agricultural, and of course these sort of mining opportunities up in the north, when the military was able to negotiate ceasefire agreements in the ethnic areas. So this mining opportunity came up and then very much well exploited. Right. So we have to now under pressure to cut military, to cut ties with military linked businesses. So the highlighter was the two UN fact-finding mission reports, especially the second one, entitled "The Economic Interest of the Military," highlighted how military conglomerates were dominant and who were they, and the foreign companies, those are working with these conglomerates in a direct joint ventures or indirect, through other third party, second party associations. So you have that was a highlighter of how military is funding itself. So we have pressure from both now international and domestic. So they've been talking about two things, but not without the third thing. Okay, what's the two things? The assets of the top military generals, visa banned, whereas a lot of people are saying visa banned, what that means is can't have holiday in Europe, ha ha ha, who cares, right? You can go to other countries, Dubai, or Asia. Okay, so assets freeze, I don't condemn it as much, because asset freeze is effective because of these top military generals. They own so much, widespread, and their freeze, it has some impact. But what they should be focusing on in designing targeted sanctions is the two military conglomerates, and hasn't been much talk about it. So hopefully they will get to that, but not much signed at the moment. So, okay, so it's the international pressures. But what is also encouraging, of course, is the domestic pressure. domestic. So unlike in 1988, our generation Z, this, not my generation, I'm older, but the other generations who are leading this movement is that, you know, they are very innovative, and then they are resilient. So you have this two movements going. First, the civil disobedience movement, which regime military coup leaders didn't expect. That was a surprise to them. So now they are boycotting. The CDM movement is boycotting any products and services that even remotely associated with the military, from a hospital to restaurants to rice brands to oil, anything. And inside the country, you've got the list. And these days, I also heard a few days ago, you have an app as well on your phone. You check whether this brand is under the boycott list. So that sort of innovations are also happening. And also lately, you have another thing called social punishment movement, that if you are associated with the military, you get socially punished, meaning that's happening in outside Myanmar, that they you know, could be that visa cancels, that we push for that, you know, socially you won't be invited to a, you know, monastery event or something. So they'd be exposed in social media. And they won't sell you things inside the country. So they were saying these brands, right? Red Ruby brand or something, are you still using it? You know, don't use it. So I think this sort of kind of healthy to say that not just we are relying on external international force, we have also now a significant, you know, a communication by social media and a pushback inside the country as well. So way forward. So this coup has brought this convergence, that this political interest and economic interests are tied, and a move forward to democracy, this too has to be dismantled. As Professor James just said, we're gonna see, you know, after Professor Yezi's presentation, you know, what we have in terms of what we learned from this Myanmar case and how we can move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hijwe. That was a fascinating presentation, which raises all kinds of questions in my mind, which hopefully we will come to after Yezid has spoken. Yezid, the floor is yours. Yezid, can you hear me? I think your microphone is off. Hello? Yezid? I think Yezid is having some technical difficulties. If I may then just briefly to follow up on a situation you sort of described at the very beginning, which was that when you had the beginning of the process of democratization in 2011, what you see often in transitions is that successful transitions are the result of some degree of cooperation between the military and civil society, and that ultimately the transition period really is a compromise, and the focus in those periods is often on the political transition rather than the economic transition. So the question that really arises is, if you're not endangering the whole transition process if you don't start addressing the economic issues up front. I think we've got Yezid back, so let's reserve this question till after Yezid has spoken, because I'm quite sure that Yezid has some things to say on that too.
Thanks, James. Thanks also for the invitation, and it's great to be involved in this Middle East Institute activity. I visited many years ago, about 30 years ago, so it's good to have a new to reconnect. I apologize for disappearing. My Zoom app decided to do something very annoying that more or less shut me out while I was trying to sort out my virtual background. So now I've got a different background. So what I'm going to do is, in fact, look at Egypt and Turkey. So the direct comparison I'm making is not between Egypt and Myanmar, but rather between Egypt and Turkey, in order to maybe offer insights to how we think about Myanmar or how we think about either case. In other words, how the role of the military's economic interests impedes political transition, or whether it can be leveraged in any way. What needs to be done, in other words, in order to remove this as an important political factor in how the military behaves. So what I'm going to do is I wasn't able to prepare a full PowerPoint presentation. However, I'm going to show you the first slide, which gives you a sense of the three main points I want to make. And I'll discuss each in a little bit of detail and then leave the rest for open discussion. So the first point I'm making here is that how the military has approached business activities, whether formal, informal, legal, illegal, commercial or industrial, etc., is very much a part of what the country's dominant economic model is. The two are not unrelated. The military developed their interests in a particular setting with its own laws, regulation, tax laws, etc. And so it emerges within this setting and then maneuvers around it. The second point I'm making clearly is that the nature, the form, as well as the extent of the military's political role is a function of its relation with various social forces or classes, if you like, including the private sector, the business community. This is another way of saying that the political economy matters, of who owns what they use it for, how they access economic resources and economic opportunity, and therefore what is the balance of interest between the military's businesses and other social actors, including the private sector, that operate in the economy and that also seek and pursue their own interests. So this is what I see as if you like, the social dimension. And then there's a political dimension of what the net outcome is of economic and business calculations, whether the military is efficient economically or simply predatory, whether it competes equally with other actors in the economy, or whether it uses its powerful political position to take what it wants, regardless of economic efficiency, of public financial efficiency, and of the impacts on the economy as a whole and on sectors such as the private sector. Where all that comes together is, of course, the political dimension, the kind of negotiations and compromises that the military might reach with other actors, whether within the state or outside the state. And again, if we look at Egypt and Turkey, that's very evident, as it is in other countries such as, say, Pakistan or Chile and others. So to touch on the economic dimension straight away, I'm going to obviously have to summarize very brutally here. Turkey and Egypt started at a comparable level of development in the 1950s. Both also adopted some of the prevalent economic models of that time, such as import substituting, industrialization. But they then diverged. And this is where immediately it gets very interesting. Turkey adopted a capitalist path to development but also involving a focus on state assistance to the development of the private sector, especially in manufacturing. So there was still an emphasis on industrialization, but the state provided a major industrial fund to help businesses, and where there was a lot of consultation with various business associations and lobbies on trade policy, for instance. And this allowed the emergence of several very large conglomerates. This is like the Korean chaebols, or comparable large holding companies in Japan and elsewhere. And the military, incidentally, the military businesses eventually emerged as the fourth largest, or one of the four large conglomerates in Turkey. The second thing to say about the Turkish economy is it's well globalized, i.e. this means it's integrated into global value chains by its local content, value added, and so on. And there's high levels of market integration. This means that people in Turkey, different groups, individuals, social groups, are active in the market. And so there's a higher level of production of wealth and the accumulation of domestic savings and surplus and so on. All of which is to say that Turkey was building itself up as a middle-income country at a time when Egypt was still lagging behind. The other point I want to make before moving to Egypt on the economic dimension is that the Turkish military was consciously committed to this capitalist path of development based on state assistance for the private sector and on industrialization. And it only stepped in when it felt that social and political struggles between the right and left, between labor unions and employers, had reached dangerous levels, that it stepped in, took power, reasserted stability, and then gave power back to civilians who it felt would continue to pursue that economic model. If I now turn to Egypt, the contrast is very striking. Egypt early on shifted to a non-capitalist path to development, what is sometimes known as Arab socialism or state capitalism. There was extensive nationalization in 1961 and state-led industrialization, which continued for about 30 years. And then two waves of privatization happened starting in 1991. But this was partial and left the state still very much in control of the economy, whether directly through tax and customs and trade policy, or indirectly by controlling licensing and regulation. So in effect, although the economy is now 70–75% run and owned by the private sector, in reality, the state still controls all economic activity. So there's a big difference there, and it's within that context that the Egyptian military developed its own business interest. The military lacked any economic vision, unlike Turkey. It didn't have any clear views on policy, didn't intervene in policy until 10 years ago with the revolution that removed the president Hosni Mubarak. And it's only then that the Egyptian military started to really scale up in a big way what until then was a small enclave, a relatively small enclave of a few key businesses it ran very inefficiently. And it's only really since 2013 that it's gained a major role in economic and business activity under the new president, Sisi, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. So the point is that it has now become a major economic actor. It delivers at least a quarter of all public works. It delivers a lot of public procurement. So in other words, it captures contracts given out by government agencies, and instead of going to public sector companies or private sector companies, the military takes over these contracts and delivers them, often using the private sector as subcontractors, but then making a big profit margin as the intermediary. So this kind of military economy is predatory to a large degree. It's rentier. In other words, it gains its income by thanks to its occupying a position of political power, the ability to award contracts and then to pass on contracts, rather than generating actual productivity increases or technological innovation or other kinds of sustainable economic growth elements. So we have two quite radically opposite or divergent economic models here, both of the economy as a whole and of the military economy within it. Now, I need to move on a bit. So I've set the stage for the key issue, of course, which is the economic dimension. The question then is, how does this play out socially and politically? Briefly, the Turkish model over the many years since the 1950s resulted in the growth of a very large middle class, a lot of it autonomous from the state, in other words, not dependent on state salaries by being employed in the civil service or in teaching or public health and so on. And because industry was assisted by the state but remained in private hands, so the private sector emerged in what you might think of as a normal profile, i.e. a fair number of large companies, a very large number of medium-sized companies, and also a very large number of quite significant small and micro enterprises with a very large middle class. And because Turkey followed neoliberal economic reforms, free market reforms starting in the 1980s, and also was given privileged access to the European Union from 1992, the Turkish economy not only evolved and grew rapidly and diversified, but this middle class also diversified. So you had an even larger number of people emerging in what was known as the Anatolian Bourgeoisie. In other words, these were people who were more conservative, Islamist leaning in terms of their political and social beliefs, and who became a parallel or rival middle class that became the voting base for the party that eventually took power in 2002, the AKP party of current President Erdogan, who has held on to power for nearly 2 decades now, thanks to this major shift in social class. Egypt, on the other hand, because of state control, and although the private sector formally accounts for the much larger share of the economy, in reality, the private sector is almost entirely dependent still on access to state contracts for public works and public procurement. And therefore, political connections, personal connections, and bribes are how business is done. This means that there has been little investment in innovation, in increased productivity. Most Egyptian companies are very local. In fact, statistics have shown, conducted by the World Bank and others, that only 1% of all Egyptian companies outside of farms, only 1% of 2 million enterprises can count as large or medium enterprises. 99% count as small or micro or nano enterprises. In other words, someone standing on a street corner selling sandwiches. This is a highly distorted profile of a private sector. This also translates into a middle class that is extremely heavily dependent on state welfare, state employment, state subsidies. And so the result of this is a middle class that is not autonomous of the state, a private sector that has a parasitical relationship to the state. Neither of them provide a source of political opposition or of political autonomy from those who govern, who rule the state. And so this takes me to my final wrapping up points about the political implications. The sources of political change don't come from a vacuum. They're not some abstract idea of democracy or whatever. We have to ask, who are the social forces that stand to benefit from one political mode or another one, and which are the ones that are likely to be committed to invest their resources, their lives, to bringing about specific kinds of political change, whether good or bad, democratic or anti-democratic. In the case of Turkey, a massive middle class emerged that wasn't so dependent on the state and therefore endorsed democratization and also brought for the first time ever an Islamic leaning party to power. In Egypt, we have the opposite situation. So where does the military economy finally affect the outcome? Well, in Turkey, the military own as I said earlier, a very large holding company called OYAC, which has 60 companies or so within it. However, these companies are formally registered like normal companies. They are run by civilians, operate entirely as private sector companies, subject to the same laws, taxes, customs duties, and also have to submit to open competition, regulation, oversight, etc. So the military hasn't used its privileged position to give itself market advantages that everyone else is denied. And in that sense, its military economy is not actually a military economy. It's simply, that the military have a share, let's say, in viable civilian companies. Now, they've been unwilling to give that up, but at least they don't alter policy to suit themselves. In Egypt, on the other hand, the military, which owns all military businesses and defense industry companies and has huge stakes, increasing now even in areas like cement production, steel production, that were dominated almost entirely by the private sector or by private and public sector civilian companies, the military has rejected bringing its businesses under any form of civilian control or oversight, doesn't pay any taxes, customs duties, or others, provides no access to its financial books or its bank accounts. And therefore, there's no real evidence that is actually cost effective for the public purse. And really, it has made it very clear that it's unwilling to dismantle any part of its economic empire in order to allow either economic efficiency or normal civilian oversight. So what we have in Egypt then is the emergence of a major military stake in the economy that will make it far more reluctant than ever before to share power, something that it might have been willing to do in the early months of 2011 after the revolution, when it said we want to preserve what we already have, but had not yet drastically expanded its share of the economy. But under President Sayigh, its role has now become central to setting policy, even in areas like digitization and so on. So I'll stop there in order to allow a lot more time for discussion.
Thank you, Yezid. That was extremely helpful. I would like to invite participants to please raise your hand and ask questions. And while you do so, let me rephrase the question that I put to Hitwe while Yezid was offline briefly. It strikes me, listening to both of you, that you come to almost contradictory conclusions. With other words, very schematically, Turkey, in a sense, is a success story of economic development. Myanmar is a story of having failed to address economic interests at the beginning of the political transition. And Egypt is a story that where the military takeover was, in a sense, the catalyst for the emergence of a military economy or an economy with the military having very significant interests. And so the question is, in a sense, can we draw any conclusions at all? Do you want to go first?
Well, hearing Turkish success stories, if the coup hasn't happened, military kept the permanent 25%, kept on operating the two conglomerates, and perhaps if we had gone down the path of restructuring them, because since 2016, these conglomerates have become under the Company Act. So they claim they have become normal companies, but of course, a lot of reforms to put through. So if they had done that, perhaps, the military probably will hope for this Turkish model. The conglomerates are still quite a big players alongside other private companies. Could have been possible that way. They still control, but sharing, a bit more sharing. But now the Egyptian model will be what the military will be hoping for in their dreams. So that will be my comparisons.
Yezid, do you want to add something?
Well, maybe as a way of opening this up even more widely, we had, the three of us, James and and myself, an interesting discussion a few days ago about sort of this, that I was very struck by how Myanmar, as a developing country that had been under embargo for a long while, with low socioeconomic development indicators and so on, over the past decade had very rapidly started to acquire many of the appearances and trappings of a more vibrant economy, and in terms of consumer habits and per capita income and so on. And that struck me for a country that had suffered in the way it had, and where the military had played such a dominant political role as well as a predatory economic one. And it's interesting partly because in Burma and Myanmar, in a way it looks like there is a significant presence of business people, of private sector businesses and businessmen or businesswomen who have some autonomy from the government, from the state and from the military, and who either were partners of the military, business partners and or political partners, or could stand in opposition. Whereas in Egypt, you have none of that. Mm-hmm. It's very striking that 60 years after the military first took power and created the Republic in 1952, and having gone through various stages of political management and even of some privatization, and officially being committed to a free market economy with massive connections with the West, a lot of Western aid and so on. And yet it's very much an economy that, first of all, is poorly globalized, and that, sorry, James, I'm having a little bit of issue with my video again.
No.
An economy that's poorly globalized, but also where big businessmen in Egypt don't form a distinct business class. They have no political clout. They can't negotiate collectively with the president, let's say, and push for particular demands. They're marginalized, they're held at arm's length, and they're very much at the pleasure of the president. If they go too far in any direction, they will be punished, and the president will use audit agencies as a weapon to open up, criminal investigations, whether justified or not. So this is very different than the situation in Turkey, where I described the emergence of major business players and economic and social classes that were a counterweight to the military and to the state. And it's also very different to Chile, where the military took power in 1973 to get rid of a socialist government, and then eventually in the 1980s. The military's closest allies, big business and the Christian Democratic Party, were the people who turned the military and said, we love you, you helped us out, the economy is doing great now, we've all done well, it's time for you to go back to the barracks. They led the pushback. And it's so fascinating that, of course, there's nothing like that in Egypt, but in Myanmar, there's not quite the Chile situation, but nonetheless, the existence of significant social and business actors that have some autonomy. And that's a fascinating insight.
No, indeed, I think it is, and it's also interesting to me that that indeed the Turkish military, but Turkey as such, and I wonder whether the influence of having been a member of NATO, having been a member of the Council of Europe, played a role in sort of shaping the path that Turkey undertook, which is very different from others. The question, of course, arises then that, in a sense, if you ever were to come to a transition in Egypt, you would essentially be confronted with the same question that Myanmar was confronted in 2011, 2012, that unless you address the military economic interests, you're not going to get a successful transition. and either both of you or one of you may want to respond to that, but I also want to encourage people among the audience to please come forward with your own questions and comments. Does either of you want to sort of address the issue of the transition?
Yes, so for Aung San Suu Kyi, has been difficult to, in her attempts to change the constitution. So long as this permanent, 25% seats for the militaries preserved, then her hands are tied in terms of, economic development and any reforms. But also, Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD party, a lot of them were ex-political prisoners. So their capabilities, while they're politically democratic, but their capabilities to look after, to lead, to spearhead these ministries is quite limited. So that has been a major criticism, as well as the capabilities of the bureaucrats in NLD has been very limited, and that's where businesses have encountered stumbling blocks after stumbling blocks. But yet, when the coup happened, who came out to the street? Middle classes, up until the violent crackdown came, and then all these people disappeared. And of course now the very militant, and a lot of them are working class workers, they're there. So they did try, but the capability is limited.
James, do you want me?
Please go ahead.
No, sorry, no, please go ahead.
No, please do, Yezid.
Well, I mean, this goes on a slightly different direction, but on the issue of transition, I think with Egypt, what is really worrying, and this clearly doesn't apply in the case of Myanmar, quite the opposite, and that's why it's interesting, that since the military took power in 2013, and then Sisi became president a few months later, what the military and various intelligence services have done is to eliminate very radically all possible political or social contenders. There are a few political parties. They are tiny, very marginal. They're only the ones that the regime hasn't felt it necessary to formally ban or outlaw. They have no role whatsoever. Parliament is stuffed with the president's men and people hand-chosen by the military and intelligence services. So there is no political arena in Egypt. And as I suggested earlier, even big business they operate as individuals negotiating their own personal deals with the military or with the president, rather than acting as a social group or class. What this means is that the president and the military have no one to negotiate transition with, even if they had a willingness for a transition. And that's what's dangerous, is that in Egypt, the success of the regime in eliminating all its rivals or potential contenders means that it's also eliminated anyone it can negotiate with. And that suggests that should the regime, the system, reach what is known as a system crisis, fundamental breakdown of, say, the economy or public finances or whatever, then if they start looking around for people to talk to, they'll have individuals here and there, but there are no organized groups of any significance to help in ensuring a peaceful and orderly transition. And that's a very dangerous situation to be in.
Right. I want to come back to this. I saw Gerard McCarthy twice briefly raise a hand. I don't know if he wanted to ask a question or not, but if you do, Gerard, please go ahead. Let's see. I'm not sure he heard me, or he'll probably come back. I mean, one of the interesting questions, certainly in what you described, Yezid, in Egypt, is that what it really means is, and it's a question of sustainability, that for foreign direct investment, there really is very limited opportunity, energy, real estate, but there really isn't a lot of opportunity in a structure in which you don't have a private sector with of any significance and depth in that sense. There's really very little opportunity for foreign direct investment. And the question is, how long is that sustainable?
That's a very good question. For Egypt, it is, you've put your finger on something very real. First of all, foreign direct investment has been slowing over the last 3 years, despite a lot of hype around Egypt as being one of the best performers in the region in terms of economic growth. And the IMF, World Bank, Western governments all, play this hype game. But when you look at the reality of the real economy, the state of individual economic sectors, there the picture is very different. There's very low productivity, little value added or local content, and very little investment, both domestic and foreign. In fact, one of the most striking indicators is that the share of private sector investment, capital investment out of GDP, the gross economy, in other words, is lower today than it was during the so-called socialist phase of the 1960s. That really tells you something about how the private sector feels about the economy in Egypt. And foreign investment, 75% of all foreign investment, which has been going into the energy sector specifically, with a bit into tourism and real estate, and almost none into the rest of the productive economy. That tells you, again, a lot about how people view the economy. It tells you that foreign investment is going into the easy, quick profit areas, low risk, where energy is mostly in desert areas controlled by the military, where foreign investors are sure of protection. And what this finally means is that Egypt relies absolutely on a constant injection of big amounts of capital, of money, from foreign sources, motivated by political reasons and not because of economic viability. So, since the military coup d'etat, the conservative Gulf monarchies invested something like $25 billion of cash and oil assistance to Egypt in the first year and a half. The IMF has given Egypt to date $18 billion in loans, and so on. So, and a lot of the private investment that goes into Egypt actually goes to buying government bonds and certificates which are offered at rates like 13–15% interest. These are, not viable in terms of Egyptian economic performance. So Egypt has to keep bringing in new sources of hard currency, for instance, from worker remittances or tourism, which right now is very low, in order to pay off these rates. It's a sort of Ponzi scheme, which survives only because of Western and Gulf political commitment to the Egyptian government. If it weren't for that, if that were ever to slow down, maybe because of, say, concern over human rights abuses or whatever, or just concern about the underlying economy, then this financial scheme through which Egypt is maintaining its balance of payments and its foreign currency reserves will start to fall apart. And that's when we look at a real crisis.
It's Joanne McCarthy here from the Asia Research Institute at National University of Singapore. I've been trying to jump in for a couple of minutes, but I wasn't able to unmute myself, so sorry about that. I just had a question, and wonderful to see you, Toi Toi, and always wonderful to see your analysis and perspective on the situation in Myanmar. But my question was more for Easy, actually, just to provide a bit of context. I work on Myanmar political and military dynamics, and especially work on the commercial interests of the kind of rank and file of the Myanmar military. And I had a question for Easy regarding kind of military enterprises in Egypt and Turkey and the degree to which their proceeds actually are shared with the rank and file. Who is benefiting from these companies? And this is, specifically the reason I ask this is that in a Myanmar context, it's really only those at the kind of upper ranks of the Myanmar military who really benefit from the shares and profits from these companies. And at a broader basis, actually many military rank and file families have their own private businesses separate to Myanmar military corporations. And this is part of a larger kind of push towards self-reliance within the Myanmar military and to get people off pensions and other state obligations in the 1990s and 2000s after the collapse of socialism. So you've got this intriguing dynamic now where actually many people at the rank and file in the Myanmar military, the coup doesn't necessarily work in their interest because as Tuete has said, there's mounting boycotts of not just big military companies, but also, military, families and their own, companies selling within the community and those kinds of dynamics, which are hitting them at a very micro level at a rank and file kind of perspective. So I suppose in terms of how these conglomerates operate in an Egyptian and Turkish perspective, to what degree is it just the military as an institution, which is using these as off-budget sources of revenue, these companies, to finance, weapons procurement and that kind of thing? And to what degree is actually the rank and file benefiting in terms of their hip pocket? Thanks.
Yezid, do you want to respond?
Oh, I thought Tuete might go first, but okay, then just briefly I'll touch.
Sorry.
Well, let me, I'll tell you what, because I'm going to cut out for a moment to try and resolve my Zoom problem. But first what I'll do is I'll just come in briefly on who benefits from the income, that bit of Gerard's question. And if you want me to address anything else, I'll come back later.
Sure.
In Turkey, the military invests through its military pension fund. OYAK is the military pension fund, and therefore not all benefits, I mean, there's shareholders and so on, companies listed on the stock exchange, but the military's share of the income, of profit, is used for, according to its own sort of pension system to increase pensions and help various services and benefits and so on. It is not used for items that normally come under the defense budget, such as weapons procurement or, salaries or whatever. In Egypt, it's the opposite, where whether formally or informally, profits are shared, especially among senior officers. This is done, it would appear, in an informal way, or at best in accordance with statutes that are set by each military agency or company for itself. I mean, it's a very fascinating way of regulating things that are formally registered. What the military also does, however, because it brings in massive amounts of money from its public works and so on, and there's no formal regulation for what happens with that income, that goes into the so-called special funds, which many government agencies have. These are discretionary slush funds by law, which they run for their own uses. The military must have quite a massive one, though we don't really know how much. This seems to be used for a number of things, from investing to launch new factories or companies, to providing benefits and perks for especially the senior officer class. I don't think any of it percolates to lower ranks, except for those who are officially seconded to military companies, where they then come under the military company's profit sharing scheme. But otherwise, the vast majority don't benefit. And finally, the army retains, it's clear, a lot of this money to finance the construction of military facilities or of military purchases. Some of the very large weapons purchases from France, Germany, Italy, and Russia of recent years may have to be funded by the army itself, because they've run out of external sources who would fund these purchases, like, say, Saudi Arabia. And although they've tried to shift the cost onto people like, say, the French banks or Italian banks, it's not clear who'll pay the eventual bill. And it may be that the army is going to have to cover some of the cost itself, as well as paying costs for future spare parts and training and so on. So there's a huge murky area there. And what we do know is that the official defense budget figures don't reflect, of course, the totality of actual defense spending, let alone actual defense funds. And we also can tell that the official defense budget has not changed over the years, despite massive increases in arms purchases. So some of this is definitely coming from military income. I'm going to stop there, log out, and come back in.
Yeah.
Okay, if you do that, then I think Hitwe wants to answer, and then I have a question from the audience from Hitwe. I'll come back to Ahmed Chalabi's question, which I want to connect to another question when
I just want to reinforce what Jared has correctly pointed out, which is so true, that the rank and files don't have, they're not shared this the military proceeds or the profits. So it's only very much concentrated at the top brass. So the rank and file, what they get is they might be given some plantations to go and work on their own, maybe a small hotels or something to go and work. So these people are actually not happy with the coup, because those are working well for them. Now the CDM movement is really targeting them. So I even heard that the former boss of SLOC, General Tan Shui, and the family, that's the rumor, that they're not happy with this coup. And you can see that the coup is only by General Min Aung Hlaing. So all these CDM movements are quite personalized. So they just the one person, because they feel that that's his decision, not the consultative, well-considered decision collectively by the military. So it's quite personalized just at the one person, which is the military general. So the view is not shared collectively, from what I can see quite clearly.
Thank you. I see Yezid is back. So there's a question from Ahmed Chalabi, which I want to wrap up into a question that I have to both of you. And that's the whole concept of pension and the pension fund. So it's where at the very beginning, you, early on in your presentation, you mentioned that pensions were one driver why the military had developed an economic interest. And obviously the pension fund, as the beneficiary owner of OYAK in Turkey, is what is the key driver of the military's economic interest. And so the question that arises from that is, in Myanmar, if we were to get, or when we were to get some sort of negotiation to try and get a transition, whether that's through ASEAN countries or through whatever mechanism, whether the bone that you throw the military, if you wish, in a sense, is a commercial holding of investments that operates within a market economy, but ensures that the military can take care in terms of retired personnel, or as in Turkey, fund clubs, health insurance, whatever that it does for veterans and for retired personnel. And in the same sense, the question then arises, if and when you get to a situation where in Egypt is no longer sustainable, if indeed some sort of similar mechanism were to be possible. And Yezid, I actually want to connect, before I pose Ahmed's question, connect one more question to that, which is, you described how, in effect, Egypt is dependent on politically motivated sovereign funding, basically. And if you go back to the early days of 2013 in Egypt, where you actually saw a move on the part of the UAE that didn't simply want to throw money into a black hole, and actually had they had a state minister based in Cairo who, it didn't all work out, but who essentially tried to rationalize and streamline this kind of thing. And so the question is whether that could not come back, particularly in a COVID and post-COVID situation, and a situation, of course, where oil revenues going forward may look very different for the Gulf states. Now, that all hooks up to the question that Ahmed Chalabi asked, in a sense, which was if there's any hope in the near future that Egypt would become a civil state, and what it would take for the army to give up its privilege. I don't know which of you wants. Do you want to go first, Tidway, and then
Yes.
let Yezid?
Yeah, so what you said about negotiated outcome, if the negotiation happens, through Norway or ASEAN, but that's not the appetite that the resistance group has right now. So the resistance groups, your CRPH, and they now talk about federal army. So if they had their way, this is not their appetite. They want to, abolish, get rid of the army altogether. But if compromise can happen and can accept it, yes, that will be the restructured military conglomerates will be a way to go if the military accepts it, and that will be a way to go. So these are the pension funds, and because also the mentality is that they're the center of the country, they're the protector of the country. So I think pension fund will be fair, but also I would say that the top brass, I'm not sure that they'll be interested, because the wealth is so much concentrated at the top, and maybe they don't also have an appetite for it.
I think before Yezid answers, it strikes me that you're dealing with two interests in a sense. One is the interest of officers making a lot of money.
The top,
and
yes.
And that's true in Egypt also. And ultimately, that's what's going to be problematic. And the other is the institutional interest, the need to take care of your people, where there may be some more compromise. Yezid, please go ahead. I think you need to unmute.
Yeah, thanks, James. Could you repeat Ahmed Chalabi's question very quickly?
Sure. Ahmed's question was whether there was any hope in the near future for Egypt to become a civil state.
So that's what
it would take for the military to surrender its privilege.
Yeah. I'll sort of try and connect the two questions. First, I'll mention that I'm actually going to be working this summer on a new paper that focuses on recommendations for dealing with the Egyptian military economy. So because I wrote this massive report just over a year ago that offered an anatomy of that economy, looking at all its distinct parts and the sort of reasons for each part and how they function and so on. So my next step is to say,
what I recommend to the audience is and it's on the Carnegie Middle East Center website.
Great, thanks. I'm referring to it simply to say that I want to go from that to use that wealth of knowledge in order to try and develop a carefully tailored approach to what would you change if you could, if there's political will, which bits might be viable and could be left in place or should be handed over to civilians, which should be dismantled completely, etc. So I will be coming to this issue in the future, and I'm already starting to think about it. Sadly, my first comment there is that there is absolutely no prospect of the military changing anything in what it's doing at the moment. It's on an upward trajectory in terms of it's sort of well into a strong upward curve of intervention, of involvement, of profit making. And this is not, and this is very much a part of the president's overall approach. Sisi openly speaks of the Egyptian state as being incompetent, inefficient, and corrupt. It's got 6 million people. That's maybe 30 million people in Egypt who relied directly on a family member who is employed by the state. In other words, 30% of the population at least, if not much more. And what Sisi is doing is he's using the military to implement economic plans, infrastructure plans, poverty alleviation campaigns, almost everything that he is concerned about. He runs through the military to run around the state and run around government regulations. All the activities he assigns to the military and things like the Sovereign Wealth Fund and other social economic development funds that he's setting up under his direct control are exempted from applying government regulations. This is crucial. So he's creating a parallel state in a way. So it's not just that the military are, still in a phase of onward momentum, which they're not, not yet ready to pull back, but it's that everything Sisi is doing is pushing forward across all fronts, and the military is a part of that, central to that picture. So we're looking at a phase of, if you like, a new phase of state building in Egypt that is quite unique. And so touching a little bit on the point that James very rightly made about the United Arab Emirates and their role, the Emirates have been clear, true, that they weren't just going to pour money in into a black hole as they did in the 1970s. And they've been insisting on return on investment, but the return is political and not just financial. What we have seen is that over the past 2 or so years, Gulf investment in Egypt has reduced a lot, or at least let's say the politically motivated assistance has reduced. There continues to be investment in big projects, especially run by the army, like big land reclamation and agriculture schemes and real estate schemes. But the proportion has declined. What Egypt has shown is that it will take the money from whoever, it will not take the advice. There's a wonderful book by the former director at the World Bank of the Egypt department, Khalid Ikram. He's got 2 books, in fact, on Egypt, wonderful ones, and quite recent, which tell the story of just how nothing the World Bank did with Egypt was ever really taken on board, partly because the US used to go behind the scenes and tell the Europeans and the World Bank and the IMF to ease off on Egypt and to allow Egypt to do whatever it was that the World Bank and others had been trying to stop it doing. So in this context, there is no international support for any of the kinds of changes, whether in politics, human rights, or even in free market economy terms, for what needs to be done in Egypt. I mean, the huge irony is that the World Bank, IMF, the UK, EU, US will sit with Egyptians who are actively restoring the role of the state in ownership, squeezing out the private sector, competing with it for credit, say in banks and so on. And at the same time, they'll happily, applaud Egypt's free market economy. So the prospect for a civil state, to come back to Ahmed Chalabi's question, is extremely low. The Egyptian state today has gone from the repressive state of Abdel Nasser in the 1960s to the crony but rather tolerant repressive state of Hosni Mubarak, which was overthrown 10 years ago, to something that is fiercer and more brutal than anything Egypt has ever seen before. This is a government that is exercising repression on a very heavy scale and bringing to bear, of course, IT technology, thanks to Chinese and European surveillance technology and eavesdropping software and so on. And finally, I mean, one example there is that, and this was a contrast I shared with Tretwe the other day, that in one day after the military coup in Egypt, the military killed between 850 and 1,200 protesters in one day, with no accountability, no investigation, nothing. And no serious consequences in terms of Western support. So the prospects for a civil state are extremely poor because as long as Egypt's macroeconomic indicators show growth and good foreign currency reserves and so on, there's going to be a very strong narrative of Egypt, the success story, being a great place to put your money, with little investigation on what happens in the real economy, and the fact that poverty has shot up massively. The World Bank itself, last year said that something like 70% of the entire population are either in poverty or vulnerable. This is a huge increase. And this is the result of the kind of policies that this government is pursuing, which is investing massively, mainly using external debt and domestic borrowing, in very fantasy real estate complexes, steel and glass skyscrapers and theme parks modeled on Dubai for the upper middle class, which is shrinking sort of by the day in Egypt. It's a huge gamble, and it'll last for the next decade, I think. But any big global shock is going to really knock the pillars away from underneath this, and the gamble will be exposed. I hope it doesn't happen just for this, because that'll lead to a real meltdown that no one can cope with. But equally, it's not a viable trajectory either.
Thank you. Before I pass on a question by Anok to Hitswe, I do want to really urge people in the participants to come forward with questions and comments. We really would appreciate your input in what is, to a degree, some uncharted ground and where we all can contribute. Hitswe, Enoch Chung asks whether you could comment on the role of crony companies or what role crony companies may be able to play in resolving the conflict in Myanmar. The second question that Enoch poses is, what about the Myanmar diaspora and corporate entities in countries like Singapore, Thailand, Australia? Would they be capable of bridging the gap between the beleaguered military and the populace? Please.
Yes, so what was the first question? Sorry,
Yeah, the first question was whether crony companies can play a role in resolving the conflict in Myanmar.
Okay, so the crony companies, during last 8, 9, 5 years at least, have grown away from the military. They had their own empires, which are independent of the military. So our hypothesis is that cronies are started to become oligarchs, in their own rights. So when this coup happened, my thought was, oh, cronies not going to be happy about this. And then you started to see one or two being targeted by the military because this particular crony is fairly popular, fairly sympathetic to the anti-coup demonstrators. And so I heard that he is now has been detained and then be questioned. So I don't think that the cronies would like to see this happen, because they're just about to perhaps internationalize. And also a lot of them in 2016 came off the blacklist of the United States. So they're now, free to fly. And then this happens at the wrong time for them. So, I mean, they don't really have a political role, but they have the economic role. So this rumors is that a crony that been detained, perhaps they wanted him for money, not for information. So, yes, they don't really have a political power. And I would say they will just play whichever in the government as well. So, but of course, for their growth and for internationalization, this has been negative for their growth.
Yeah, I think, and Enoch had a second question, which was the role of the diaspora, as well as whether corporates in places like Singapore, Thailand, Australia that have an economic interest in Myanmar, whether or not they can play a role in resolving issues.
Yes, so the geopolitical side of Myanmar is complicated. So it's further complicated by, China and United States, have a interest in the country. So that really plays a complicated role. But for the overseas diaspora, fiercely they're supporting CDM movement, now CRPH, social punishment. So when the social punishment movement came in, then the diaspora suddenly had a quite an active role, and social media very actively targeting, identifying, targeting, promoting, even vaguely military links people to be targeted. But as to political role, I don't think they have any. And Singapore, of course, can do more in terms of the banking as a banking hub. So if you target the money trail, chase the money trail of the military companies and their associates, their cronies, that's where Singapore can play a huge role to hurt the financial interests of the military.
Before I come to a question by Adraj Anand for Hitwe, I want to pick up on what Hitwe said, and also one of the last things that Yezid said, which strikes me that in the current situation, one of the crucial differences between Myanmar and Egypt, and maybe in some ways a potentially decisive difference, is the fact that in Myanmar you actually have at least parts of the international community, the West, engaged in opposing the military regime, whether one thinks it's sufficient or not, being neither here nor there. Whereas in the question of in the situation that Yezid describes, the Egyptians don't really have to worry because no one's concerned. Would that be a right conclusion?
Yes, so Myanmar, I would say because of the image of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, especially in contrast to the generals, in their uniforms and not much knowing the international norms, PR. So in the contrast, I think it has grabbed the attention of the world. And also around the democratic change, 2011, 2012, the visit of Obama, and then Hillary Clinton, I think that has also popularized the Myanmar. And when the US sanction lifted, eased, and the foreign investment came in, and they knew, the Western businesses knew that all the eyes are on them to do responsible business. So I think it's on the world stage for these reasons. So Myanmar has been watched, for their foreign direct investment to be very clean, to do the good thing.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything, Yezid?
No, I think not on this. I mean, I'd rather hear more from your audience.
Fair enough. Okay. We have a question from Adraj Anand, and this may be the last question, unfortunately, but he's asking Hitwe, in Myanmar, what might a negotiated outcome look like? Under what circumstances exactly would the military compromise with the civil disobedience movement and NLD as far as its business interests are concerned?
Okay, for now, military doesn't look like it wants to compromise at all. So because violence attack is every day increasing. So maybe Chinese government can play a role here in bringing the two parties together. But the other side is also now quite strong in their condemnation of the military. So I don't think these negotiations is gonna happen anytime soon. So that's a worry as well. So I think it's gonna go ahead with the fight rather than the negotiated outcome. And also there has been a bit of speculation that if Daw Aung San Suu Kyi is released, will she then would not want the violence that looks like looming violence because of the federal army forming, and the ammunitions and all that, perhaps from the militia. That's a possibility as well. So there has been some concern that will she say violence is not in order? So I think people are going ahead, pushing ahead with this, the military attack rather than looking at other solutions. That's also because I don't think military wants to negotiate. Maybe more pressure is needed for them to come down and negotiate. No indication of that so far.
If I can take that question one step further, and that is, you're seeing indications very early that Myanmar could turn into a situation where you have an armed resistance. And one would assume that that's one scenario that ASEAN really does not want to see. So
No.
the question is whether that, in a sense, would be the icebreaker.
Yeah, because even in ASEAN, the democracies like Indonesia, even Korea, I think they are showing strong condemnation. They are showing. So ASEAN is not also, has been some differences in opinion of tackling the regime. So there might be some hope here. But as the biggest investors like Singapore, China could play a bigger role. And the military thinking is also, they looks like they don't mind the economic interest affected, so long as they have this political power, and then they'll fix it later. And might be very bad for the ordinary people of the country, but for the top brass, probably will not mind. So so long as they have this political power and ruined economy, they'll preside over it and perhaps try to fix it down the track. Not very of a priority, top priority. I don't think it is at the moment, from what I can observe.
Okay, we're unfortunately coming to the end of this. Don't just leave yet. First of all, I do want to thank Hitwe and Yezid. For what I think, and I hope was for them as well as for others in the audience, a really productive session in terms of food for thought, and really raising some very basic questions about how you deal. And Yezid mentioned he's starting to think about these things with regard to Egypt. How do you get out of these quagmires in terms of the economic role of the military, which I think is something that may be worthwhile talking about further, maybe initially in a smaller circle, in terms of trying to learn the lessons from the comparisons and the differences. Before we end, the organizers have asked me if you would stay for a couple of seconds, because they want to do a screenshot of the speakers. In any case, thank you all for participating. I hope this was as useful to you as I found it. And I would welcome you to stay in touch with MEI, visit the MEI website for our future events, of which there are many and equally fascinating. Thank you very much.